Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you today about something that I think we've all experienced at some point in our lives, that feeling when someone you care about ignores you. It hurts, doesn't it? It can sting like an open wound, and it's so easy to get lost in that pain. But what if I told you that beneath that hurt, there's something more? Something that holds the potential to transform not just how we see others, but how we see ourselves. Feeling ignored can be one of the most painful experiences we go through, often leaving us with a sense of emptiness, confusion, and even rejection. It's easy to see being ignored as a reflection of our inadequacy or a sign that we aren't worthy of someone's time or attention. But what if we shifted the perspective on this? What if we recognized that instead of an attack on us, the feeling of being ignored is actually a powerful signal from within a moment of vulnerability that can help us grow? Vulnerability is often misunderstood. It's not something to be feared or avoided. It's an essential part of being human. When we experience vulnerability, especially in the form of feeling ignored, we expose parts of ourselves that are raw, unguarded, and open to the world. But this exposure is not something that diminishes us. In fact, it's a gateway to strength. It's in these moments of emotional exposure that we are given the opportunity to face our fears, acknowledge our discomfort, and ultimately build resilience. When we are ignored, we often experience emotional pain. This pain is a natural response to our need for connection, for validation, and for belonging. We want to be seen, heard, and valued, and when that is denied, it's a direct hit to our sense of worth. But instead of viewing this as something to shy away from or suppress, we can begin to understand that vulnerability is not a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of courage. It's an opportunity to reflect on our own reactions and beliefs. We can ask ourselves, why does this hurt so much? What am I truly afraid of here? What part of me feels unseen? In this way, vulnerability is a tool for self-awareness, a way of uncovering what lies beneath the surface of our emotions. By acknowledging our vulnerability when we feel ignored, we start to unravel the layers that shape our sense of self. We realize that the pain of being ignored is often less about the other person and more about how we've placed our self-worth in the hands of others. We may have unknowingly tied our identity to external validation, to the approval of friends, family, colleagues, or even strangers. This makes us susceptible to the actions of others, like being overlooked or dismissed. But when we accept vulnerability as part of our human experience, we are freed from the need for constant external validation. We begin to understand that we are worthy not because of how others perceive us, but because of who we are at our core. In those moments when we feel ignored, there's an opportunity to cultivate self-compassion. Instead of turning the hurt inward or letting it define us, we can embrace it with kindness. We can remind ourselves that it's okay to feel vulnerable, it's okay to hurt. And it's okay to not always have the answers. Vulnerability teaches us that we don't have to have it all together or be perfect. We are allowed to be imperfect, to feel lost, and to seek connection, but we don't have to let these things dictate our worth. Vulnerability is a practice, a willingness to show up fully, even when we don't feel fully put together. It's about being real and honest with ourselves, acknowledging the discomfort, and sitting with it rather than running from it. So, feeling ignored doesn't have to be something that diminishes us. When we embrace vulnerability, we tap into a strength we didn't even know we had. We begin to accept that our worth isn't determined by the presence or absence of others in our lives. Rather, our worth is inherent. And it's in those moments of being ignored, of feeling vulnerable, that we have the chance to reconnect with that inherent worth, to rediscover our own strength, and to learn the valuable lesson that we are enough, regardless of how others see us. When we feel ignored, the immediate reaction is often one of confusion and pain. It's natural to assume that being ignored reflects something wrong with us, that perhaps we aren't valuable enough to receive the attention we expect or crave. But what if this feeling of being dismissed or overlooked isn't about us at all? What if, instead, it's an opportunity to turn inward and examine our relationship with ourselves? The truth is, the emotional pain we experience when we're ignored often signals a deeper issue within us, a disconnection from our own self-validation. We live in a world where external approval is often equated with self-worth. We base our sense of value on how others see us, on whether we are included in the conversation, acknowledged in the room, or praised for our efforts. We tie our happiness to the attention and acceptance of others. So when we are ignored, it can feel like a rejection of our very being. But this reliance on others to define our worth leaves us vulnerable to emotional distress. When the validation we've sought is withheld, the resulting hurt can feel overwhelming. It's as if we've been stripped of our sense of value and we're left questioning who we are and whether we matter. However, this is where the opportunity lies. The pain of being ignored can serve as a wake-up call, a reminder that we've outsourced our worth to others. It's a signal that we need to look inward and reconnect with the part of us that doesn't rely on external validation. Self-validation is the ability to recognize our own worth, to see ourselves as valuable regardless of how others treat us or how much attention we receive. It's an act of self-respect that allows us to feel whole without needing constant affirmation from others. This process of self-validation begins by acknowledging that we are already enough just as we are. We don't need to prove ourselves to anyone. We don't need the approval of others to feel worthy. Our value isn't dependent on being noticed or acknowledged by someone else. It's inherent in who we are, in our unique experiences, and in the gifts we bring to the world. When we fully embrace this understanding, being ignored no longer holds the same power over us. We learn to sit with the discomfort, but we don't let it define us. Self-validation also involves being kind to ourselves in moments of vulnerability. Instead of turning the hurt inward, beating ourselves up for not being good enough or likable enough, we practice self-compassion. We remind ourselves that it's okay to feel hurt, that it's okay to want connection and acknowledgement, but that these things don't diminish our worth. We are still worthy of love and respect, regardless of how others act. This shift in mindset helps us to stop depending on others to fill the gaps in our self-worth, and it allows us to build a stronger, more resilient sense of self. Furthermore, learning to validate ourselves can be a transformative practice. It's not something that happens overnight, but rather a gradual process of unlearning the belief that our value is contingent on external opinions. This doesn't mean we stop caring about others or that we shut ourselves off from the world. It simply means that we become more anchored in our own sense of worth. We stop seeking constant cultivate and instead cultivate a deep inner knowing that we are enough with or without external acknowledgement. When we practice self-validation, we begin to realize that being ignored isn't a reflection of who we are, but rather a reflection of someone else's actions, circumstances, or limitations. It may not have anything to do with us personally, and it certainly doesn't diminish our inherent worth. The moment we start validating ourselves, we stop giving power to the actions of others. We shift from seeking approval to seeking alignment with our own values and sense of self. In this way, we begin to experience true freedom, the freedom to be ourselves, to honor our needs and desires, and to stop depending on the actions of others to feel good about who we are. In the end, the act of self-validation is a profound practice that helps us shift our focus from external approval to internal acknowledgement. When we learn to validate ourselves, we no longer need to rely on others to tell us that we matter. We know it already. And this internal knowing allows us to weather moments of being ignored with grace and resilience, knowing that our worth is not contingent on anyone else's recognition or attention. When we look to others for validation, we are, in essence, giving away our power. We place our self-worth in the hands of other people, allowing them to define who we are based on their opinions, their treatment of us, or their approval. In a world where social dynamics often revolve around the exchange of acknowledgement and recognition, it's easy to fall into the trap of seeking validation from those around us. But this external reliance is fragile. The problem with looking to others to validate our worth is that their actions, opinions, and behaviors are not within our control. And when someone ignores us, it becomes painfully clear just how tenuous our sense of value can be when it's rooted in the approval of others. When we depend on others to validate our worth, we open ourselves up to vulnerability. If someone we care about doesn't pay attention to us, doesn't acknowledge our efforts, or flat out ignores us, it can feel like a direct rejection of who we are. We may start questioning our actions, our worth, and our place in their lives. The sting of being ignored can make us feel insignificant, unimportant, or invisible. But this is a dangerous path to walk. When we allow our sense of worth to be defined by others, we relinquish control over our own lives. We give away our power to people who may not even be aware of the impact they have on us, and we open ourselves up to the emotional roller coaster of trying to gain their approval. This cycle of external validation is what makes us vulnerable to the emotional hurt that comes with being ignored. If our self-worth is tied to the reactions and attention of others, we're left feeling powerless when that validation is withheld. However, the truth is that our worth is never dependent on anyone else's perception or treatment of us. The way someone treats us or whether they notice it says more about them than it does about us. It's a reflection of their own capacity to connect, acknowledge, or engage, not a statement about our value as human beings. The key to breaking free from this dependency on external validation is to recognize that we are the ultimate authority on our own worth. Our value does not fluctuate based on the attention we receive from others. It is inherent, unshakable, and constant. When we learn to validate ourselves, we free ourselves from the emotional roller coaster of trying to win approval or avoid rejection. Self-validation is the practice of affirming our own worth, regardless of how others treat us or whether they notice our efforts. It's about cultivating a deep sense of self-respect and self-acceptance that doesn't rely on external feedback. This shift can be difficult because it requires us to let go of the habit of seeking approval. We may have spent years or even decades measuring our worth by the attention or affection we receive from others, and it can feel like a major shift to let go of that need. But when we start to validate ourselves, we take back the power to define who we are and what we're worth. We begin to recognize that we are valuable not because of what others say, but because of who we are at our core, because of our kindness, our strengths, our unique experiences, and our ability to love and care for others. The practice of self-validation is also an ongoing process. It's about building a deep inner knowing that we are enough no matter what. We may still feel the sting when we're ignored, but instead of letting it define us, we use it as an opportunity to reconnect with ourselves. We ask ourselves, what do I need right now to feel whole? And how can I show up for myself in this moment? This process of nurturing ourselves and cultivating our own self-worth becomes a powerful way to combat the emotional pain of being ignored. When we stop looking to others for validation, we shift from a mindset of dependence to one of self-sufficiency. We no longer need to chase approval or seek affirmation from others because we already know our worth. This shift not only makes us more resilient in the face of rejection or indifference, but also allows us to approach our relationships with a sense of balance. We are no longer looking for others to complete us or make us feel valued. We are whole as we are. In a world that often pushes us to seek external validation, learning to rely on our own sense of worth is a radical act of self-empowerment. When we stop depending on others to tell us that we matter, we start to recognize that our value is intrinsic, constant, and unchanging. We take back the control that was once in the hands of others and reclaim the strength that has always resided within us. When we experience the feeling of being ignored, our initial instinct is often to focus on the pain and confusion that accompanies it. We might spend hours analyzing why it happened, what went wrong, or how we could have behaved differently. It's easy to get lost in that cycle, letting the hurt grow and fester. But what if, instead of allowing that hurt to consume us, we chose to use it as an opportunity for reflection and growth? Instead of seeing being ignored as something that's happening to us, we can start viewing it as something that's happening for us, an invitation to check in with ourselves and reassess our needs. In those moments when we feel ignored, it's important to pause and reflect on our internal state. Being ignored doesn't just hurt because of the external circumstances. It often brings to the surface deeper emotions, unmet needs, and unexpressed desires. It can remind us of our longing for connection, for recognition, and for belonging. But in focusing too much on the other person's actions, we may overlook the chance to look inward. The truth is, these moments can be an invitation to listen to ourselves more closely and reconnect with what we truly need. The first step in this process is acknowledging that our emotions are valid. It's normal to feel hurt, confused, or frustrated when we're ignored. These emotions aren't something to push aside or dismiss. They are signals. They are telling us that we crave attention, care, or acknowledgement. Instead of turning these emotions into self-criticism, we can treat them with compassion. We can allow ourselves to feel whatever comes up without judgment, and in doing so, we create space for healing. The pain we experience from being ignored is often a reflection of our deeper desires to be seen and valued. Rather than judging ourselves for having these desires, we can honor them as a part of what makes us human. Once we accept our emotions, we can move to the next step, understanding the need behind the emotion. Often, when we're ignored, it's not just the lack of attention that stings, it's the feeling that we are not worthy of that attention. We may ask ourselves, why doesn't this person care? Or what's wrong with me that they can't even acknowledge my presence? But in this moment, it's important to recognize that the issue may not lie with our worth at all. Instead, it's a reminder that we need to pay attention to how we are valuing ourselves. Our pain can reflect an unmet need for self-acknowledgement. When we feel ignored by others, it's an opportunity to ask ourselves, am I truly seeing and valuing myself? Am I meeting my own needs for connection, recognition, and care? This question helps us shift the focus from external validation to internal fulfillment. By using moments of being ignored as opportunities for self-reflection, we can learn to identify patterns in our behavior and in our emotional responses. We might find that we tend to seek out validation from others too much, or that we place too much of our self-worth in the hands of people who are not emotionally available to give us the attention we seek. These realizations are not meant to shame us, but to help us develop a deeper understanding of how we operate in relationships. It's a chance to examine how we communicate our needs, how we advocate for our own worth, and how we show up for ourselves when others fail to do so. Moreover, when we use the experience of being ignored for self-reflection, we begin to empower ourselves. Instead of feeling helpless or at the mercy of others' actions, we take responsibility for our own emotional well-being. We stop looking to others to meet our needs and start finding ways to fulfill those needs within ourselves. We might begin to take more time for self-care, set boundaries that honor our value, and seek relationships that are reciprocal rather than one-sided. Ultimately, we create an internal sense of validation that doesn't rely on others to confirm our worth. Being ignored can also be a catalyst for deeper emotional intelligence. The more we check in with ourselves in these moments, the more we understand our own emotional triggers and desires. We start to build emotional resilience because we no longer depend on others to dictate our feelings. We realize that we have the capacity to heal and nurture ourselves. This practice of self-reflection then becomes a tool for emotional growth, helping us navigate the complexities of relationships and the inevitable moments of hurt with greater ease and wisdom. By embracing these moments as signs to reflect, we cultivate a deeper, more compassionate relationship with ourselves. When we stop seeking external validation, we begin a powerful shift in how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. For most of us, seeking approval from others has become second nature. We measure our worth by the attention we receive, the praise we're given, and the affirmation others provide. In many ways, we've been conditioned to equate our value with how others perceive us, and this can leave us vulnerable to emotional turmoil when we face moments of rejection, or worse, when we feel ignored. But when we stop looking for external validation, we free ourselves from the weight of that dependency. We reclaim our self-worth and shift the focus inward toward a more sustainable, empowering way of living. This shift in perspective doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of unlearning the habits and beliefs that tell us we need others to tell us we are enough. For many of us, seeking validation from others is deeply ingrained. From a young age, we learn to seek approval from parents, teachers, friends, and society. We receive feedback from others that shapes our sense of self, and over time, we begin to internalize the belief that our value is tied to how others see us. But as we grow older, we realize that this external validation is fragile. People's opinions change, circumstances shift, and we can't control how others perceive us. When we depend on external validation, we leave our self-worth in the hands of forces beyond our control. The result is often emotional instability and self-doubt, especially when we experience moments of being ignored or dismissed. When we stop seeking external validation, we begin to understand that our worth is intrinsic. It is not determined by how others treat us or how much attention we receive. Our value exists independently of external feedback. We are worthy of love, respect, and care simply because we are human, not because we've earned it through others' approval. This realization is empowering because it shifts the responsibility for our self-worth from others to ourselves. We begin to recognize that we have the ability to affirm our own value, regardless of what others think or do. This doesn't mean we stop caring about others' opinions or that we don't value healthy feedback and connection. It simply means that we no longer depend on those external sources to define who we are. When we stop seeking validation from others, we create space for self-acceptance. We begin to embrace ourselves, flaws and all. We acknowledge that we don't need to be perfect to be worthy of love or respect. We can show up as our authentic selves with all our strengths and vulnerabilities and feel at peace with who we are. This self-acceptance is not a one-time event, but a continuous practice of honoring our uniqueness and embracing our humanity. It's about recognizing that we are enough just as we are, without the need for constant reassurance or validation from others. As we stop seeking external validation, we also start to cultivate a deeper sense of self-compassion. Instead of criticizing ourselves when we make mistakes or fall short of expectations, we offer ourselves the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a friend. We begin to recognize that our worth is not tied to our achievements or external measures of success. We are valuable simply because we exist, and that knowledge allows us to treat ourselves with gentleness and care regardless of the external circumstances. Furthermore, when we stop seeking external validation, we start to make decisions based on our own values rather than the desire to please others. We begin to act from a place of authenticity rather than approval-seeking behavior. This shift allows us to pursue goals and relationships that truly align with who we are, not based on what others think we should be or do. We stop compromising our integrity to fit into someone else's vision of who we should be, and instead, we honor our own path and our own truth. Ultimately, stopping the cycle of seeking external validation gives us the freedom to live more fully and authentically. We are no longer dependent on others' opinions to feel good about ourselves. We learn to trust our inner voice and align our actions with our true desires and values. This freedom allows us to navigate life's challenges with a sense of resilience, knowing that our worth is not defined by others' perceptions, but by our own inherent value. When we stop seeking external validation, we no longer live in reaction to the opinions of others. We live in alignment with our own sense of worth, power, and authenticity, and that is a truly transformative experience. When we feel ignored, we are often forced to confront one of the most basic human needs, the need to be seen and understood. At our core, every person desires connection and acknowledgement, to be heard, valued, and appreciated by others. It's a natural part of human existence to crave recognition, and when that need is not met, it can create feelings of isolation, confusion, and frustration. But what if, instead of seeing being ignored as an outright rejection or as a failure on our part, we recognize it as a sign to explore our relationship with ourselves? The feeling of being ignored can serve as a powerful mirror, reflecting the areas of our lives where we may not be paying enough attention to our own needs, or where we may not be truly seeing or acknowledging ourselves. The pain that comes with being ignored often stems from the belief that our worth is dependent on the acknowledgement of others. In these moments, it can feel as though we've been discounted, dismissed, or made invisible. This can lead to self-doubt and anxiety as we question why we weren't worthy of attention, why we weren't seen, and whether we are somehow flawed. But this perspective is based on the assumption that our value is determined by the actions or perceptions of others. In reality, being ignored is not a reflection of our worth, but rather an opportunity to examine the ways in which we value ourselves. It's a chance to pause and ask ourselves whether we have been truly paying attention to our own needs, desires, and emotions, or whether we have been placing too much of our self-worth in the hands of others. When we experience the hurt of being ignored, it can serve as an invitation to practice self-awareness and self-compassion. Often, the pain we feel isn't just about the other person's behavior, it's about how we've been neglecting our own inner needs. Being ignored can highlight the areas of our lives where we have been seeking external validation or approval, neglecting to recognize our own worth from within. This realization is not something to feel ashamed of, but rather an opportunity to grow and shift our focus inward. It's a moment to ask ourselves, am I acknowledging my own needs? Am I giving myself the love, care, and attention that I seek from others? These questions encourage us to turn the lens on ourselves and practice self-compassion, recognizing that our worth doesn't hinge on others' behavior. In these moments of being ignored, we are called to nurture ourselves. We may have relied too heavily on others for validation, only to be left feeling empty when that validation isn't given. But self-compassion teaches us to fill that void from within to provide the emotional support we need for ourselves. Instead of waiting for someone else to acknowledge our value, we can acknowledge it ourselves. We can remind ourselves that we are enough just as we are without needing to be recognized by anyone else. This practice doesn't mean we stop seeking connection or that we become indifferent to the attention of others. It simply means that we shift our sense of worth from the external to the internal. We begin to rely less on others to affirm our existence and more on our own capacity to recognize and value who we are. The experience of being ignored can also teach us the importance of boundaries. Often we find ourselves in situations where we are seeking recognition from people who may not be capable of giving it. whether due to their own issues or their inability to meet our emotional needs. Some people may inadvertently ignore us or dismiss our presence. This doesn't necessarily mean that we are unworthy of attention or love. It simply means that the person or situation may not be the right fit for our emotional needs. In these instances, being ignored serves as a reminder to reassess our relationships and whether they are mutually supportive. We may find that we have been placing too much of our emotional energy into relationships that do not nourish or appreciate us. It's in these moments that we can use the experience of being ignored to set clearer boundaries, letting go of relationships that drain us and focusing on those that nurture our emotional well-being. Additionally, when we stop relying on others for validation, we learn to trust ourselves more fully. We stop seeking permission to be who we are and start accepting ourselves as we are. The experience of being ignored can teach us that we don't need to constantly prove ourselves to others or seek approval in order to feel worthy. Instead, we can begin to take ownership of our lives, our feelings, and our value. We can trust our own inner wisdom, knowing that we are worthy of respect and connection without needing to be seen or acknowledged by everyone. In doing so, we cultivate a deeper sense of self-confidence and emotional resilience, knowing that our worth is not contingent upon the actions of others. Ultimately, being ignored isn't just about the external experience, it's about how we internalize that experience. It offers us the chance to reflect on how we relate to ourselves and others, to examine the ways we may have been neglecting our own needs or relying too heavily on others for validation. It's a powerful moment to practice self-compassion, self-awareness, and self-validation, shifting the focus from external approval to internal acknowledgement. And in doing so, we begin to recognize that we are always worthy, always enough, regardless of how others choose to see us. In conclusion, being ignored can be painful, but it also serves as a powerful opportunity for self-reflection and growth. Instead of allowing it to define our worth, we can use it as a sign to turn inward, acknowledging our own needs and valuing ourselves without depending on external validation. By cultivating self-awareness, practicing self-compassion, and setting healthier boundaries, we empower ourselves to navigate life with resilience and confidence. Ultimately, our worth is not determined by the attention or approval of others, but by our own recognition of our inherent value. When we embrace this truth, we find strength in our own self-acceptance and are free to live authentically.